Alexander the Great, the world-famous military genius who created one of the largest empires in history. After death, his body becomes one of the most venerated objects in the classical world. Pilgrims, including the most powerful emperors, pay homage at the shrine of the king. Then, during the first half of the first millennium, all trace of this site of colossal fame and importance simply vanishes.
We have found nothing at all.
This has produced one of history's greatest unsolved riddles. Destroyed, hijacked, or something more sinister. We open the mystery files on the quest for the tomb of Alexander the Great. The year is 323 BC. One of the most important and successful leaders in history is dead, Alexander the Great. Before the age of 33, he had created one of the largest empires in history. After his death, thousands of square miles of territory are up for grabs. Dr. Michael Scott is a leading classicist at the University of Cambridge.
In the aftermath of Alexander's death, there is no clear successor. And all of Alexander's generals are infighting to become the next Alexander the Great.
With so much wealth and territory at stake, there is much to gain. Any link with the great man himself might promote the legitimacy of a claim to inherit the larger and richer parts of the empire. And for the peoples of antiquity, a powerful connection is via the physical remains of a king.
To own the bones of a particular important individual could mean the legitimacy and prosperity of a particular community.
One of Alexander's generals, Ptolemy, understands this well. He brings Alexander's body to Egypt, to the town founded less than a decade before the great king died, Alexandria. Here, he founds a dynasty that will produce powerful kings and queens, including Cleopatra. He and his successors build Alexandria into a world-class city, and at its center, his symbol of power and legitimacy, the mausoleum housing the mortal remains of Alexander himself.
The tomb of Alexander the Great becomes a sightseeing point.
This symbol of power becomes the focus for visiting dignitaries for centuries, right into the era of the Roman Empire.
Most famously, Octavian, who will become the Emperor Augustus, he comes to see the tomb and body of Alexander the Great. When he's given the opportunity to see the body of not just Alexander the Great, but the other Ptolemaic kings, he replies, "I came to see a king, not a bunch of dead people."
Dr. Jean-Yves Empereur has spent a career researching archaeological evidence of the history of Alexandria. He and his team have uncovered thousands of priceless artifacts, from amulets to figurines to large statues. They paint a vivid picture of life in Alexandria and include plenty of evidence of Alexander's importance to the city. But when it comes to the archaeological evidence of the tomb,
We have found nothing at all.
the city has been built up over centuries and is now a modern metropolis, making excavation difficult, sometimes impossible. Alexander's tomb is lost, but scholars have not given up the search.
In the absence of archaeological evidence, we have to turn to the evidence we do have, which is the textual evidence of the ancient sources.
Andrew Chugg has collected dozens of ancient eyewitness accounts of the tomb.
There are plenty of texts which identify the body of Alexander and his tomb as having been located in Alexandria.
Many of these references occur during the first 3 centuries AD, or as we also say, Common Era. And then almost all references end. Suddenly there is a lack of eyewitnesses. Nobody knows for certain why. Examination of what else was going on in Alexandria at the time might provide clues about what happened to the tomb. The majority of reliable references to the tomb stop in the latter half of the 3rd century. At this time, the Roman Empire is going through a period of violence and rebellion.
The 3rd century AD has often been called the crisis century for the Roman Empire.
Economic depression and poor governance of the provinces is causing the empire to fragment. This leads to dissent, rebellion, and in the worst cases, extreme violence and destruction.
And it's particularly in the Eastern Empire, or near Alexandria, that there are particular problems.
Zenobia, the warrior queen of Palmyra in Syria, takes advantage of the weakened Roman Empire and invades Egypt. Zenobia conquers the city. Rome retaliates with force. The queen is captured. Order is restored. But Alexandria doesn't stay at peace for long. 30 years later, there is another major uprising, this time led by local rebels. The Roman Emperor Diocletian is forced to invade. He besieges the city and destroys it.
Diocletian was so angry that he said during the sack of the city that he wouldn't halt the bloodshed until the blood came up to the knees of his horse.
Decades of war, invasion, and rebellion destroy much of Alexandria. This period of lawlessness coincides with the end of the majority of eyewitness references to the tomb, leading some scholars to suggest that it was during these decades of anarchy that the tomb was destroyed and lost forever. But although most records referring to the tomb stop at the end of the 3rd century, researchers have discovered an intriguing, isolated mention from much later.
In the 4th century AD, we have a writer called Libanius of Antioch.
Specifically, he says that the body of Alexander was on display in Alexandria, and we know from the context that this was approximately AD 390.
If this reference is accurate, it records the existence of Alexander's body 100 years after the violence in the middle of the 3rd century, which would imply the tomb survived until the end of the 4th. But the lone Libanius quote is the absolute last known mention of Alexander's body and tomb. If this reference truly signifies the last sighting, then what caused it to vanish from the records forever? Dr. Nick Saunders is an archaeologist.
One of the reasons why the textual evidence, the written evidence, stops in round about 390, 391 AD is because there was a revolution of spirituality.
For thousands of years, the people of Egypt, Greece, and Rome had believed in many gods. Cults to hundreds of deities exist across the known world. But in the 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine embraces a relatively new cult, Christianity.
300 years after the death of Jesus, we find Constantine, who wants to become Roman emperor. And he adopts the minority cult image of Christianity, the cross, as part of a protective amuletic device on the shields of his army, and puts Christianity on the road as well to becoming the official state religion sponsored by the Supreme Emperor Constantine.
Some scholars believe that the rise of Christianity can explain the loss of Alexander's tomb. The great king even though he has been dead for 600 years, is perceived as a threat to the followers of Christ. The reason for this lies in what happens to the king after he dies. In life, he was a great military leader, but in death, he becomes divine. Alexander is worshipped as a pagan god.
Alexander is really the first in a long line of leaders who will start to morph from being just a man into something more, approaching a divine being.
For a while, the old pagan order and the veneration of gods such as Alexander coexist with the new Christian religion.
This was an empire in flux. It was officially Christian, but it wasn't actually totally Christian for hundreds and hundreds of years. Within that, there were explosions of pagan activity and a lot of subversion going on at the same time.
The 4th century reaches a critical turning point. In Christianity, there is only one God. Paganism is polytheistic. This creates a great conflict of religions. Alexander the Great, the general who in life had conquered the classical world, in death faces his strongest foe, the armies of Christ.
Early Christians were extremely fundamentalist in their views. Everybody should become Christian. Pagans were the absolute enemy.
At the time of Libanius' last mention of the tomb, Christian zeal has reached the Emperor Theodosius.
During the 380s, he has a series of decrees which ban not only pagan festivals and feasts, but looking at the entrails of animals to divine the future. He closes the temples, and importantly, he makes non-enforcement of these rules also a crime, a punishable crime.
Alexander is a pagan god. Christians are being instructed to close down temples dedicated to pagan gods. But the Christians go a lot further.
The real fundamentalist movers and shakers of Christianity in Alexandria at this time went round destroying all kinds of images and temple carvings and hieroglyphics and any inscription which had to do with paganism.
Archaeological evidence in Alexandria dramatically illustrates the extent Christian fundamentalists went to stamp out paganism.
You see that quite physically in Alexandria, because it's in 392 that the local Christians attack one of the most important sanctuaries in the city, the Serapeum, and destroy it to the ground.
Archaeologists have discovered evidence of violent destruction at the temple complex dedicated to another god, Serapis. Because Alexander is the eponymous god of the city, the theory is that if the temple complex dedicated to Serapis and all other gods were destroyed, Alexander's would have suffered a similar fate. The Serapeum is the scene of terrible violence. The results are dramatic.
As you see, there is no more structures, there is no more stones. Everything has disappeared.
The prevailing theory is that Alexander's tomb was destroyed along with the Serapeum and all the other polytheistic shrines. For after around 390, there is no known reference to Alexander's tomb. However, some believe that this is not the end of the story. A radical alternative theory has been proposed, one that seems to come right out of a conspiracy novel. 1,200 miles from Alexandria, across the Mediterranean Sea, lies the Italian city of Venice. One of the main tourist attractions is the basilica overlooking the famous St. Mark's Square. Excavations in the oldest foundations of the basilica produced an intriguing block of sculpture. The artwork on the front is from a design much older than the church.
It has a shield on it, it's got a life-size set of arms, in fact. There's also a long spear. It appears to be part of a high-status Macedonian tomb.
Alexander's home country was Macedonia in southeastern Europe, and the artwork on the block is strikingly similar to that used on Macedonian tombs. Shields and coins, such as this in Chugg's collection.
It was either minted by Alexander himself or by one of his immediate successors, and one side of it represents a Macedonian shield, and the central device is indeed a 8-pointed starburst, just like on the sculpture in San Marco.
A sculpture in the style of a Macedonian tomb discovered in Venice. Might just be a coincidence. But maybe there is a connection between Alexander and the basilica. Andrew Chugg has noticed that right after Libanius' last mention of Alexander's tomb, references start to appear to the tomb of someone else, the Christian St. Mark.
We first start to get mentions of a tomb of St. Mark that can be dated accurately almost the next year in AD 392.
St. Mark lived in Alexandria in the 1st century. But in spite of over a decade of research, Chugg has found no references to a tomb of St. Mark before 392 CE, in spite of him being dead for nearly 350 years.
The interesting thing then is that we have these references that are talking about the appearance of St. Mark's tomb on a timescale just after the disappearance of Alexander's body.
St. Mark and Alexander have an obvious link.
In the case of Alexander, he's the founder of the city, and that's the reason for its name, of course. In the case of St. Mark, he's the founder of Christianity in the city of Alexandria, his first chief Christian official.
St. Mark has been dead for around 350 years, and it seems there is no reference to his tomb until the explosion of Christianity at exactly the same time references to Alexander's tomb stop. The coincidence in time is matched by a coincidence in location. Ancient references place Alexander's tomb at a crossroads at the center of the city. A medieval map of Alexandria claims to show the location of St. Mark's tomb.
This map locates the site of St. Mark's body, and it happens to be near where the crossroads of ancient Alexandria was, where it looks as though Alexander's mausoleum may have been.
Chugg believes the medieval map places Mark's tomb at a crossroads at the center of the ancient city. Alexander's tomb is also believed to have been located at a crossroads at the center of the city too. This has led Chugg to a radical suggestion.
They might have actually been in the same place. It almost looks as though the tomb of St. Mark took over from the tomb of Alexander as being the central core sanctuary of the city of Alexandria.
This theory fits with evidence from all across the Roman world. Renaming and adapting temples and rites from pagan to Christian was extremely common.
The temples are abandoned, but of course they're extraordinarily ornate, well-built constructions in a world that now needs a space in which to conduct the religion of Christianity. And so it's no surprise that a lot of those temples got immediately transformed and reused as Christian churches.
As the early Christian church struggles to assert itself, it is easier to switch the focus of places of worship to a new god. Andrew Chugg believes that this is the fate of Alexander's tomb.
The disappearance of Alexander's corpse seems to happen immediately before St. Mark's tomb arrives in Alexandria. They seem to be in the same place. The mausoleum of Alexander seems to be in more or less the same place as the church of St. Mark, which housed his tomb. The possibility is that they actually used the same body. They may have switched identities.
If Andrew Chugg's theory is correct, the search for the final resting place of Alexander the Great now takes a bizarre and shocking twist. In the second half of the first millennium, much of the eastern Mediterranean, including Alexandria, is conquered by Muslims. Over the coming centuries, Christians in Europe are eager to reclaim the holy places from the infidel and save the relics of their saints. This leads to the Crusades. A major trading and military force in medieval Europe was the Italian city-state of Venice, whose patron saint was, and still is, Mark. His image still adorns the buildings of Venice, and his symbol, the lion, can be seen all over the city. The Venetians want the body of their saint, but it is trapped in Alexandria under Muslim control. Artwork on the front of the basilica dedicated to the saint in Venice illustrates an extraordinary story.
Some Venetian merchants arrived in the city in 828 AD. They either persuaded, bribed, or otherwise obtained the body of St. Mark, and they took it back to Venice with them.
The mosaics depict the body snatching.
It's said that the two Venetian merchants, Tribunus and Rusticus, they needed to smuggle this body past the Islamic authorities.
The basilica illustrations show Muslim officials repulsed by something in the basket. Pork.
Pork was anathema to the Islamic people, so they simply put it in a basket and put a layer of pork on top, and thereby got it through to their ship.
The images show a celebratory homecoming in Venice. Today, the Catholic Church claims that the body still lies in the magnificent cathedral dedicated to the saint. If Chug is correct, the body in the basilica might be that of the pagan god king, Alexander the Great. The theory that Alexander's tomb was renamed to St. Mark's and then his body brought to Venice is one of many possible suggestions. But as in all scientific inquiry, no suggestions can be ruled out without conclusive proof.
Maybe one day a piece of evidence will be found that will solve the problem. Until then, we just have to go on searching.
It does, however, illuminate another possibility for scholars to examine in the 2,000-year-old quest to discover the final resting place of one of history's most famous kings, Alexander the Great.